The first impressions German officers formed of America's aircraft carriers came not from textbooks or intelligence reports, but from the vast, unforgiving ocean itself, where steel leviathans cut through swells like colossal shadows. In the early months of the Second World War, when the Atlantic was still the main theater for German naval operations, the Kriegsmarine was a force built on a different philosophy. Most officers carried in their minds an image of a navy that relied on the sheer power of battleships like the Bismarck, the surgical precision of its cruisers, and the silent, suffocating menace of its U-boat wolfpacks. Aircraft carriers were considered novel, almost experimental, perhaps useful in niche reconnaissance roles, but hardly the core of a serious fleet. To the German Naval Command, the carrier was a fragile concept. The Royal Navy had them, of course, but they were limited in size and number, often seen as vulnerable assets that required a heavy screen of destroyers and cruisers just to survive. German officers, steeped in the tradition of gunnery and surface engagements, tended to dismiss them as floating tinderboxes, their wooden flight decks an invitation for a well-placed shell. This deeply ingrained perception, a mix of arrogance and genuine strategic belief, began to slowly, painfully unravel as first-hand reports of American naval strength trickled into the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. At first, these whispers from the deep sounded exaggerated, like the tall tales of exhausted sailors. Submarine captains, the grizzled veterans of the Atlantic, returning from their grueling patrols, described immense, unbelievable silhouettes spotted on the horizon. They spoke of ships larger and faster than anything they had ever imagined. These were not mere carriers in the European sense, not the converted cruisers or modest flat-tops they were familiar with. These were floating fortresses, behemoths that seemed to combine the impossible mass of a battleship with the wings of an entire airfield. They were, in the words of one stunned U-boat commander, floating cities of war. German naval intelligence, the B-Dienst, diligently intercepted signals and pored over grainy reconnaissance photographs, but paper and ink could not convey the sheer, soul-crushing scale of the reality. The numbers just didn't seem real. How could one ship carry nearly 100 aircraft? How could it generate enough power to launch and recover them in the middle of a storm-tossed sea? It was a logistical and engineering nightmare that defied their understanding of naval architecture. It was only when German officers had the rare, terrifying chance to see these vessels for themselves, or more often to study their devastating impact after an engagement, that the full, chilling shock began to set in. One of the most stark and brutal awakenings came not for a sailor, but for a pilot of the Luftwaffe. Imagine being a seasoned German aviator, flying a Focke-Wulf Condor on a long-range patrol over the Atlantic. You've been trained to identify every ship in the Allied inventory. You spot a convoy, and with it, what your recognition manual identifies as a single carrier. But as you get closer, the scale distorts your perception. The ship doesn't just sit on the water, it commands it, a sprawling industrial island of steel runways, cranes, and antennas. Then the sky erupts. It isn't a handful of fighters scrambling to intercept you. It's a swarm. Dozens of Grumman F-4F Wildcats buzzing like angry hornets pour off the deck in a continuous, terrifying stream. Before your mind can even process the impossibility of it, your bomber is riddled with machine gun fire and you're spiraling into the cold, dark water below. This was the experience of countless German reconnaissance pilots. They were not fighting a ship. They were fighting a mobile air base that could project overwhelming power hundreds of miles in every direction. The American Essex-class and Yorktown-class carriers were a paradigm shift. A single one of these ships carried an air group more powerful than the entire air forces of some smaller European nations. Think about that for a moment. German strategy was built around the idea of the fleet in being, using powerful surface raiders to disrupt supply lines. The Bismarck's legendary hunt was a testament to this doctrine. But how do you fight an enemy that can bring its own air force to any point on the globe? The Americans weren't just building ships. They were building mobile territories. On board, thousands of men operated a complex 24/7 city dedicated to a single purpose: war. They had their own machine shops, bakeries, hospitals, and power plants. They could repair battle damage, build new parts, and sustain operations for months on end without ever touching dry land. To the German military, which prided itself on efficiency, this level of self-sufficiency was both admirable and deeply frightening. But here's where the story gets even more insane. It wasn't just the size and number of aircraft that stunned the Germans. It was the doctrine behind them. The Americans had developed a revolutionary system, the Carrier Task Force. They didn't send carriers out alone. Instead, they grouped them into powerful formations, often with multiple carriers sailing together, surrounded by a ring of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This created a layered defense of staggering complexity. The outer ring of destroyers hunted for submarines. The cruisers provided anti-aircraft fire. The battleships, with their massive guns, were there to handle any surface threat that broke through. And at the center, the carriers themselves provided the ultimate weapon, a fist of air power that could strike an enemy fleet before it ever came within sight of the American ships. German naval planners, who had envisioned a repeat of the great gun duels of Jutland, were left staring at a chessboard where their opponent was playing an entirely different game. Their own carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, was an embodiment of their flawed thinking. It was a beautiful, powerful ship on paper, armed with its own cruiser-caliber guns, a sign that its designers still couldn't let go of the idea that a carrier should be able to fight a surface battle. But it was a hybrid, a compromise, and it was never completed. It sat in port, a monument to a naval philosophy that had become obsolete before it was ever put to the test. The Americans, meanwhile, were churning out Essex-class carriers at a rate that defied belief, launching a new one every few months. This industrial might was a weapon in itself, a relentless tide of steel that the German war machine simply could not match. The final bitter realization for the German High Command was that America's carriers had rendered their entire naval strategy irrelevant. The U-boats, their most effective weapon, were now hunted not just by destroyers, but by carrier-launched aircraft that could patrol vast swaths of the ocean, dropping depth charges with deadly precision. Their powerful battleships, like the Tirpitz, were forced to hide in Norwegian fjords, trapped by the constant threat of carrier-based air raids. The Atlantic, which they had once hoped to dominate, had become a graveyard patrolled by these floating cities. The war at sea was no longer about who had the biggest guns, but who controlled the skies above it. America's carriers were more than just ships. They were a declaration of a new era of naval warfare, a floating testament to industrial power and strategic innovation that left their adversaries in a state of shock and awe. This shift, from gun-centric navies to carrier-centric fleets, would go on to define global military power for the rest of the 20th century and beyond, a legacy born from the immense steel shadows that haunted the imaginations of German officers on the cold waters of the Atlantic.